All right, welcome to the Global Street Fight. I'm Ron Locke. I'm Managing Director of Chicago for GNS Business Communications. If you're unfamiliar with GNS, we're a full-service communications agency. We focus on organizations that are facing business challenges and need strategic and creative engagement programs. If you have any questions about the agency, we have a number of people from our headquarters in New York, our Chicago office, as well as our office in Raleigh, North Carolina, and they'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. So why the global street fight, you'd probably ask. And by the way, I find it interesting how many people are willing to tell their coworkers they're going to be out of the office to attend a street fight. This is actually just a big social experiment. Whether you passed or not, I'm not telling. But the global street fight started about 4 years ago. In New York, we started these programs when the economic recovery was just taking root. And we wanted to explore the impact that this hyper-competitiveness of the global marketplace and the hyper-connectivity was having on the C-suite, on communicators, on the communities that they serve. And so we put together this program. And we call it the street fight because what we were finding is in this new dynamic of hyper-competitiveness and hyper-connectivity, it was more dangers popping out unexpectedly. And it took strategies that were more street fighting, you know, the improvisation to take on these challenges than perhaps being a four-star general and very orderly in your response. So we call it the street fight, and while the recovery is further along, this fight rages on. So at this point in the program, I wanted to have the Let's Get Ready to Rumble guy come up here and give us his catchphrase, but unlike the state of Illinois, we have a budget. And so I'll just introduce the moderator of our first panel, Luke Lambert, President and CEO of GNS Business Communications.
Thanks, Ron. Gentlemen, have a seat. I wanted to introduce first to my left Al Cave, who is the Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer, Risk Management at Northern Trust, and Tyronne Stoudemire, who is VP and Global Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Hyatt Hotels Corporation. And we are just delighted that you guys could join us today. We just had a fascinating 15-minute conversation. I can't wait to share some stories, share some anecdotes, and have a chance, because this clock is ticking already, have a chance for you guys to ask some plenty of questions as well. I wanted to start, for you both, to give a little context for today's session. You've got a room here of a pretty select group of communicators, senior communicators, who are trusted advisors to the C-suite. And many of them, and there's a few that are actually members of the C-suite in their role as chief communications officers. So that just gives you a little bit of background. But I wanted to spend time talking about the dynamic that we're seeing in the C-suite and how the dynamic is changing and how CEOs, we're in a 24/7 news cycle. They're under more scrutiny than ever. And they are surrounding themselves with a broader range of skill sets. Now, financial acumen, still critical, more critical than ever. Operational expertise, extremely critical. Al, I know you have legal expertise. That's extremely critical. But they're looking to expand the inner circle with people who understand emotional intelligence, understand culture, have empathy throughout the organization. And so I'd love to spend some time on that as well. But with that, because you're living proof of the expansion of the C-suite, I was hoping we could get to know you both a little bit. So the first question, I'm going to actually throw to both of you, is could you each tell us a little bit about your road to the C-suite? Maybe start with a little bit of background, how long you've been in the organization today, but why were you enlisted by the CEO? Or was it the CEO? And what was that transformational moment that that made your role created within the organization? I was wondering if you could start there. Maybe we'll go to Al first.
Sure. First, good morning. It's a thrill to be here. Thank you for having me. I've been with Northern Trust, it'll be 11 years in July, which makes me a short timer at Northern Trust. I took a bit of an unconventional route, I think, to the compliance position I now hold. I began as an attorney in Boston, working with employment law. From there, I moved in-house to a food retailer, where I had employment law and some regulatory responsibilities, as well as for a few other functions in the organization. Then moved to an HR role at that food retailer, straight HR, no legal responsibilities. Then, about 12 years ago, moved to Chicago and basically repeated that process. I worked in a law firm for a year, practicing employment law, then joined Northern Trust as an employment lawyer, then took on responsibility for what we call employee resources, then took on responsibility for a straight HR role while retaining responsibility for employment law and employee resources, and then made the move to compliance 3 years ago. At Northern Trust, everything that we do is kind of an organizational move, so I report to the Chief Risk Officer, who is the primary recruiter, if you will, but the CEO and the President also were involved in the process. And what the CRO wanted me to do when he talked to me about the role was to make compliance cool, and I'll leave that thought there.
So actually, I have a little different approach. I began my professional career at Hyatt Associates, based in Lincoln, Illinois, here in Chicago, right outside of Chicago. I actually began my career in operations. So I was running call centers, and we grew from 5,000 to 20,000 employees within a 5-year time period. In more than 70 countries. It was a huge undertaking for Hyatt. We were on the bubble of the outsourcing. So outsourcing was a really big deal during that time. Former CEO Dale Gifford came to me and asked me to lead our diversity efforts. And I initially told him no. Primarily because it was a very homogeneous environment. Many of our leaders were homegrown in the organization. Very seldom did they bring people from the outside to the inside into management. When I interviewed for the job, I had 5 interviews with 5 different people. So I met 25 people during that interviewing process. And what the problem was is that they really couldn't identify whether I was black or that I was from India. And they couldn't ask the question, right? So that was my first initial start. And I did not want to be the poster child for the blacks at Hyatt. And I got these all H's now, Hyatt, Hyatt, right? I did not want to be the poster child for diversity, so I did not want to enlist for that. And no one in upper management looked like me, and I didn't want to be the guinea pig. So I actually told him no. Is I reserve the right to come back later because there's some things I can't share with you right now, but there's a reason why we're asking you to take this responsibility on. And he kept his word. He came back. Now, he's a little more prepared than I'm prepared. So I had some conversations with some trusted mentors of mine about diversity and running it and so forth and so on. And he said, we really need you to take this job, and I can't take no for an answer. And I says, well, I will do it under 3 conditions. First and foremost, that you become the executive business sponsor. It's critical that what's done at the top, when the CEO says to do something, for the most part, everybody lines up and does what the CEO says. I would like to believe that, right, Luke? Second, that we had revenue, a true budget. We needed resources to really do the work. And his response to me was, well, how much do you need what do you need? And I had no rhyme or reason. I just made the number up. I was processing an invoice to a client. It was $2.8 million I was trying to reconcile. I said $2.8 million. I just threw it out there. He says, you got it. He said, what's your last request? Now, growing up in Detroit, Michigan, the conversation around the dinner table with me and my parents was, never find yourself in a non-revenue generating job. So I was moving from operations into HR, and when times are bad, the people that tend to leave first are your HR people. So I said, so if we can turn this into a revenue-generating function, then I'm ready to, I will take the job. And he delivered on all 3. When the first year out the gate, we did about $4 million in revenue on diversity consulting. We built it internally, tested internally, and then took it to the marketplace. So after doing that, and we grew, and then we were acquired by Aon, and that's been 18 years at Hyatt. I was then acquired by Mercer, who was Hyatt's direct competitor. They asked me to come over and to establish a diversity consulting practice in their talent business and to lead with analytics. So we led with an evidence-based analytic strategy diversity strategy, looking at individuals by levels and pay bands in the organizations to provide interventions for people who were stuck in the pipeline. Again, more than $10 million in revenue in 1 year. So the need was there, the desire was there, but the brand that I had in this space afforded us entree into organizations to do additional consulting work other than benefit administration and record keeping. 2 years into that job, I get a phone call from Hyatt saying, we want you to come over and lead our diversity efforts. And anyone that's in Chicago know that the Prickster families pretty much are really kind of rule for the most part. You never tell Tom Prickster no. So I couldn't tell them no, joined Hyatt, and I've been at Hyatt for, it'll be 2 years in September. And the job had been empty for a couple of years, and they wanted to have someone to create a strategy and to drive the process throughout the organization. So we have 100,000 employees across 50 countries with 10 brands, which is very unique and different. So it was a different model for me to work with. But to date, we've been extremely successful with moving the work of diversity and inclusion for Hyatt Corporation. And we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, and I'm gonna get back to evidence-based analytics and making compliance cool in a second. But I did want to ask Al, I learned a few minutes ago this may not be the best way to describe you, but I'm describing you as a Northern Trust veteran. You've been there 11 years. And Al, and we can go in order, Al can go first, Tyronne next, because Tyronne is 2 years into this job. And I'm just wondering, as a veteran at Northern Trust, how does that institutional knowledge, how has it kind of helped you advance your own cause in terms of advising the C-suite on their global strategy?
So first, we have to talk about the term veteran and whether I'm actually a veteran at Northern Trust. We are blessed with great retention, many long-term Northern Trust partners. We have a quarter-century club with, I think, something like 600 active employees in the club, and many hundreds more who have retired. So I think that I've been at Northern Trust long enough to be recognized as a loyal partner, which is what we call employees. And I've certainly interacted with many people across the organization and learned enough about the organization that when I interact with people, they know my intentions are pure and they're for the best interest of the bank. At the same time, my relative junior status of only 11 years and the fact that I didn't grow up in Northern Trust or even in finance, most of my time was either in a law firm or food retail, allows me to bring a different perspective and perhaps sometimes be successful with that perspective within an organization where so many people have grown up with Northern Trust and don't have that external experience. So I try to combine my knowledge of the organization and its people and the culture with a different perspective, a different way of looking at things to try to move the company forward in a positive direction without sacrificing any of the things that have made us great for 126 years.
Well, that actually does support our theory about the expansion of C-suites with outsiders and with an outsider viewpoint. So thanks for clarifying, and I could see how it would be viewed that way, very much so. Tyronne, you are an outsider.
I am
so
an outsider.
How was that
Still
influenced? How
considered-
does
still
that
considered
influence
an
your
outsider.
Yeah, and how does that influence the guidance that you provide?
So the safe haven for me was
Yeah.
that the board and the CEO wanted to bring someone from the outside leading this space. They wanted an outside perspective. They wanted a fresh perspective. Hyatt was not new to diversity. Hyatt had been doing diversity for more than its 50-year history. If we look at Atlanta, Georgia specifically, it was the first high-rise built in downtown Atlanta, but it was the first hotel that allowed Martin Luther King to have his meetings. Right, so this is no stranger to us. In Chicago in 1957, Hyatt was also the first hotel not only to allow blacks to work there, but they also allowed them to stay at the hotel. Because oftentimes in 57, you could work at the hotel, but you couldn't stay, and you had to come through the back door. So the history of Hyatt's diversity and commitment to inclusion has always been there. But they wanted an outside perspective, someone that come with a strong brand to help build the brand from a recruitment perspective. So we look at workforce, workplace, and marketplace. So how we show up in minority communities is very different. For example, you guys may not be familiar here, but there's a parade called the Bud Billiken Parade, Chicago. It's the second largest parade in the country. It is a back-to-school parade for African Americans, predominantly African Americans that are in the south side of Chicago. We had a float. We participated, and there were people in the community who didn't know what Hyatt was. Individuals who had never journeyed downtown or never came into the city, never know what's a Hyatt, who's Hyatt, and how can I get a job. That was an aha moment for our leaders to see that we need to build the brand. We also see that in the research we've done is that African American Latinos are saying, I am not going to send my child to Yale, Harvard, Princeton, or historical black college to work at a hotel making beds. So we also needed to make sure that we were branding to understand the next generation of workers and making sure they understood us as an organization. So again, no stranger to it, but having that outside perspective made a big difference because we have individuals that have been with the organization for 20, 25, 30, 40 years, right? And organizations that's going to be successful, the strategy is to build and buy talent simultaneously. Tenure does not necessarily equal achievement, which is another hurdle. So historically in our environment in hospitality, that historical legacy and tradition would dictate that only white men can run hotels. That was another change for us. But having it, no one wanted to say that internally, but have an outside person come in challenging the organization, and I was told to push the organization. Now, some leaders told me to get to know people, go out and shake hands and kiss the babies and be nice to everyone for 2 years. Right? Don't try to make any changes, just go out and meet, but that's not how I'm wired.
No, it doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, that's not how I'm wired. So I'm a man of action and going for results. So again, getting right into it and creating the environment where everybody can thrive and strive together, coupled with the culture, because we're a culture of care.
Right, forcing them to think differently. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I've had great response from the leadership of the organization, and most times in diversity there's a push and a pull. They're actually pulling me into conversations. They're pulling me into, I work across the entire enterprise.
Yeah, great. Al, let's get back to it because you said your CEO, as one of his first charge, was to make compliance cool. And I was hoping you could explain the thought process that you went through when he gave you that charge and the strategy to kind of making that cultural pivot in the organization.
Well, my first reaction was to be very, very energized by that charge because had never worked in compliance, but I'd always had a healthy respect for compliance. And I'd always thought that the compliance function is very similar to the legal function, but I also knew that compliance isn't always held in the same regard as a legal function. So that was my first reaction. Then the second reaction was, boy, wouldn't that be fun if you could take something that most people don't think of as cool, and too many people have kind of a negative preconceived notion about, and make it cool. That really captured my attention and fascination. And so for a variety of reasons, we've set about to try to make compliance cool. First off, we recognize that compliance is a very difficult profession, especially in finance, especially today. And the challenges over time could lead to a demoralized workforce. So the first goal was to make sure that the people performing compliance appreciated how important and cool they are as individuals and how important and cool their work is. And so if you talk about diversity and inclusion, we really encourage people to bring their full selves in compliance to work so that they could, wear colorful socks or do whatever they needed to do to demonstrate that they're real people and make their messages and the business's desire to work with them more prominent. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we recognize in compliance that our message is in competition with many other important messages in the industry today, whether it's revenue or what have you, just constant competition. And if most people don't have a positive reaction to compliance, all the more reason why you need to compete. So finding new and creative ways to train people, finding new and creative ways to teach people about policies, finding new and creative ways to engage people in a fun manner such that they want to come and engage with you. Maybe not all the time because they want to learn about compliance policy, but they want to engage cool people, a cool function, and have fun doing something that is otherwise thought to be an unpleasant task. That's number two. The third thing in trying to make compliance cool is attracting other cool people to the function. Again, if you accept the premise that working in compliance is a challenge and over time can become demoralizing, then who's going to want to raise their hand and join that function, especially if it's one the rest of the organization thinks is blah. So making compliance cool is also a great recruitment strategy as well as a retention strategy. So all of those kinds of things are what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. And I think that's exactly what the CRO and CEO had in mind when they said make compliance cool.
Yeah, that's great. And I think as communicators, our ears are probably perked up a little bit when we hear that, because it seems like we have a great opportunity, and we'll get to that hopefully a little bit later in terms of a new story to tell within our organizations. Tyronne, back to you. You're speaking to communicators again today. When we hear the word analytics, it gets us pretty jazzed. You're using it at Aon successfully, quite successfully, the way you described it, evidence-based analytics. And I know you've brought this skill set with you to Hyatt, and I wondered if you could share with us how you're using evidence-based analytics and combining that with the unique culture that exists at Hyatt to put together a diversity and inclusion program that actually works.
That actually worked really in my benefit because our CEO was a former CFO, so numbers is a good deal for him. So I did my homework, right? So leading with the evidence base that's in front of us, looking at our population of people across the global landscape, looking at it by brand, looking at it by age, because we have an aging population. So how we look and communicate to our colleagues that are about to retire is very significant to our business. Yeah. So that was really attractive to Hyatt. And working with our communicators, just as Allan said, there's so many competing priorities, and so oftentimes diversity doesn't necessarily hit that top 5 or that top 10, if you will. How do we can combine the messages together to be more inclusive? Yeah. And doing that through the data has been very, very impactful. I believe that adults learn from an aha moment. They get feedback, they can self-correct and influence others, influence systems. So as we become a storytelling organization and we care for people to be their best and we lead it with empathy, that data becomes real relevant for us. Right, to be able to talk through the number of guests that come through our hotel for the first and second visit. What does that look like? 80% of our reservations are made by women. What does that look like for us on a consumer side? How do we now make sure that the shower curtains are to the left and they're not closed so that the women don't think that someone's in the tub when she enters into the room? Having makeup mirrors and having stands for women to put their makeup on. Even looking at the face cloths and how women will wear makeup, and if they wash their face, the makeup is left on that face cloth. All those types of things are done through analytics, so we can look at our consumer and we can then build messages around that to make sure that we're hitting the needs of not only our consumer, but also our colleagues that we work with from day to day. So the evidence base has become a common language for us at Hyatt. It's no stranger because on the sales side, they use analytics all the time, and our marketing team uses it all the time. So now to embed diversity and adding that in there makes it a very easy conversation to have in our environment.
Yeah, terrific, terrific. Shifting gears a little bit, as communicators, I think I mentioned to you we have a couple CCOs here, and so we're proud of the fact when communicators have a role, a seat at the table in the C-suite. But generally, there's a lot of us that still have a complex, right? That we'd like to have a better, a stronger voice and a better seat at the table. I think there's a great opportunity as the C-suite is expanding to work closer with the C-suite, with people like in your positions. And I was just wondering if you could talk about how you work today with your communications team and on what kind of activities.
I want to give a couple examples of organizations, and this is all documented. You can go out and research and you'll see it pop up, that made major mistakes from a communications perspective. For example, when Gerber Foods went to South Africa and went to Japan, the packaging fell flat. It's pretty, the Gerber, the baby on the box and the pretty blue eyes and the fuzzy hair, and the consumers were horrified with the packaging. It wasn't because the baby was white. Their interpretation was, we don't eat our young. You see that? We don't eat our young, right? When Chevrolet went to Spain and rolled out the Chevy Nova that was very popular in this country in the 70s, Nova means Novell, means won't go. Who buys a car that doesn't go? So you talk about cross-cultural competence and understand other cultures and how you communicate those messages are really critical to the success of the organization. McDonald's being the most celebrated company in the world for diversity and inclusion. However, when they went to India, the first McDonald's was burned down to the ground. It was a $100 million lawsuit. Not that they sold beef They had enough intelligence to understand that the cow was sacred, but they fried their French fries in alamo oil and lied about it. So if you Google McDonald's in India, you will see McDonald's a family restaurant. It doesn't, that logo doesn't exist anyplace else in the world. In order to regain the trust of the consumer, they had to dive in from a culture perspective and know that Indians have a tendency to lead with family, and family is important. They leverage that concept to be able to regain their brand. Now take that to Hyatt as we talk about imaging and messages. When I joined Hyatt, every piece of collateral that we had an African-American doorman, which would suggest and interpret by other cultures that the only jobs that blacks could get would be a doorman, because they didn't exist anyplace else in any other the recruiting collateral, any of the advertising that we had, and those messages that you send out to communities, to your potential consumers is critical. If they don't see themselves in those images, they can't imagine themselves to be a part of that, will not celebrate the brand.
So you were proactive working with your communication team.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
That was my first stop.
So they didn't see you, you sought them out.
Now, the other benefit for me is that we were absent a CMO.
Okay.
And so our CEO was playing the role as CFO, CMO, and CEO, right? So we were active searching for these roles, and we got them on. So I got a chance to really come in and influence from a communications perspective. And they had several examples. For example, there was a commercial that we did, and they were really, they did a very good job. We were about 95% there, right? And they had every demographic represented. They had the Asian young man in San Francisco with high heels and pearls. They had the Latinos, the Asian, had every demographic covered except the white male. So the pendulum had swung too far, trying to accommodate that what they thought diversity looked like, and excluded unconsciously the white male. And when I asked the question of the group, I says, "What's missing in this video?" They were complex. They were like, "We've got everybody. We've got two blacks, 2 Asians, 3 Latinos. We've got them all." And I says, "Well, you're missing the white man." And I was like, "It's like, dang." Right? So again, you have to have, I think communicators have a unique, so HR and communications could play a very critical role in the C-suite, because you're advising the senior leaders on talent. And how to communicate to that talent and what messages come out. Because the communications, it hits like another example, and good examples here. A professor at Northwestern University was on a United Airlines flight. She asked for a can of Coke. The flight attendant says, "No, I can't give it to you. Policy says that we can't." The gentleman next to her asked for a can of beer. He gives her a can of beer. He's a white male. She's Muslim. She has her garb on. This makes national news. So now Coca-Cola has to defend that message, and now United Airlines has to, because she's now tweeting and doing social media right in that situation. Real time, she's now talking about the fact that and the reason why the flight attendant did not give her a can of Coke, because she said you would take it and make a bomb out of it. It's those type of messages. That's an aha moment, right? And does it happen? Those are the types of things that when you talk about the C-suite, how do you help as a communicator, help to craft the right messages for that CEO to go to market and communicate that? Microsoft, the CEO gets up and says, "Women have to wait for their time." He is still living down that mistake.
Right. And that's where we said we've got a 24/7 news cycle, which does make our jobs a little bit more interesting than ever.
And it's global.
Yeah, and it's global.
And it's
right.
global.
Exactly.
So those messaging, I think, is really getting in front of that, being aware of current events, understanding the cultural aspects of those current events. What is the culture of the organization? What will you support or not? You have to live and die by the values of the organization. You can't waver.
Right, right. Good point. And closely aligning with HR, I think, was a critical point. Al, your experience working with your communications team?
Yeah, so if you agree with everything that I said about compliance beforehand, it's not too far a leap to say that we're not really in the job of compliance, we're in the job of marketing and communication. And that might be a bit of a different paradigm shift for people in compliance, but it's absolutely true. So what we are doing is we've formed a working group composed of compliance people and communications people, and we're trying to do 2 things. One, you could go out and try to train everybody in all of the intricacies of regulations to make sure that they are well-informed, well-educated, and knowledgeable about the regulations. There are hundreds of 100-page regulations. Some are even 1,000 pages. So while we do need to do some sort of training, what we're trying to do more is just get people to ask a question, to notice things around them and then ask the question. That's what the compliance function, that's what the legal function is there for. So that's one of the things. The second thing is traditional compliance communications or trainings are delivered by email, written in quasi-legalese, run on far too long, and are really, really boring. So with our communications partners, we are trying to take advantage of all the different forms of communication that the company offers, not just email, but voicemail, plasma screens we have in the hallways, live interactions, any kind of videos that are usually delivered by email but also posted on our intranet site. So there are many, many other vehicles that compliance hasn't used to get out its message, and we're trying to get those messages out in more creative, entertaining ways. Everybody likes reality TV, so we've styled a lot of our training and a lot of our communications as reality TV, either things gone wrong outside of Northern Trust or things that didn't go as well as we would have liked inside Northern Trust, and most important perhaps, things that went well inside of Northern Trust, all told in the first person by people involved in a very kind of non-stilted, non-scripted manner. And our communications partners are critical in that effort.
Great, good practical advice and some innovative ways to look at it. Let's talk about reality TV for a minute. I wanted to throw a headline at each one of you, and then give an answer or a reaction in terms of the current event and how it relates to your current function. And so, Al, I'll start with you. I know you're a sports fan. I know Chicago's a big sports town, and I'm not going to give you a local team because I don't want anything thrown at us. But we're coming off one of the major sports spectacles of our country, March Madness, NCAA basketball. It captures all of us. It captures our offices with office pools, et cetera. What made this year remarkable to me was a New York sports team. Syracuse University makes it to the Final Four. We have an orange in the house. Good. So am I, by the way.
She might throw something at you after she...
No, that's okay. But what made it remarkable is they make it to the Final Four, and they did that with their head coach on the sideline for the first 9 games of the season. And why? Well, the NCAA did a pretty thorough investigation, and they cited them over 10 times, whether it be academic misconduct on the team, failure to adhere to policy with their drug testing program. The list goes on. And I found it fascinating the more I read, and is this, when the ruling came down, it was a compliance issue for the NCAA. And it was a compliance issue and a leadership issue pointing to the coach, who was a legend at the school. And react to that. What went wrong? Where was the flaw? Was the flaw in the leadership, or was the flaw in the culture of the university?
It's an excellent question, in my opinion. And apologies to anybody who may not be a sports fan, but I think the issues are easily translatable irrespective of the industry. When you pick up the paper today or a magazine and read about anything gone wrong at any company, I'll bet you what's in my wallet that culture is mentioned. It is, whether it's a fad or whether it's a reality, the media and regulators are focusing so much on the culture that is set, the culture that was allowing whatever defalcation or violation or breach to occur. Same thing with sports. Syracuse University was hit with some pretty harsh sanctions. The University of North Carolina is under investigation. There was another one that came out right before Syracuse. Southern Methodist, I believe it was. In each of those circumstances, they say that the coach failed to create a culture of compliance. And what do the coaches say? The coaches say, well, I had no idea this was going on, which completely misses the mark. There are some people who say, well, the coach should know. That's his or her job. But the reality is The coach doesn't need to know everything that's going on. You're always going to have a rogue employee go do something, especially if you're in a large company like Hyatt, right? You can't prevent all of the people you hire from doing something wrong. But what you can do is firmly and consistently and repeatedly tell people that it's not acceptable in your organization. That goes a long, long way towards keeping people from doing the wrong thing. Being a visible leader, walking the floor, or being present at all kinds of hours, going to visit the dorms where your athletes stay. Those kinds of things help set a culture of compliance such that, number one, people know that they shouldn't do these things, even behind your back, and number two, if they do them, you've somewhat inoculated your firm or yourself from whatever happens. I'll give you a great example, in my opinion, that's happening right now. The University of Louisville basketball team is under investigation because somebody on Rick Pitino's, the head coach's staff, allegedly hired call girls and strippers on a number of occasions to entertain players and recruits. Now, what does Pitino say? I knew nothing about it. Well, first of all, Mr. Pitino had his own problems a while ago in a scandal. And secondly, my humble opinion, he didn't clearly say, this is unacceptable, else the person who went out and did this, who happened to be one of his mentees, by the way, would never have even tried it. And this kind of thing could not have occurred in an environment of compliance culture. So that's one thing. The second thing is, over the weekend, the University of Louisville, same exact school, same exact athletic program, rehired their football coach, or re-upped, gave him a multi-million-dollar contract over a number of years. Well, this is the same gentleman who was dismissed by the University of Arkansas program after he crashed his bike with his paramour on board and lied about it. And his paramour happened to be an employee of the athletic program. So what kind of culture is the University of Louisville creating? What kind of message does that send about a culture of compliance? And I think this goes back to the point of the address. You have to have, it has to be more about wins and losses. It has to be more about revenue. It has to be EQ type matters as well.
Starts at the top. Yeah, great point. And I thought I don't mention North Carolina, but you did, but that's okay. So
there's a reason for that.
on a really serious note, Tyronne, I wanted to talk about, we have 70 people in our Raleigh, North Carolina office, but it's blown up, the issue of the House Bill number 2 issue in the news. And I wanted you to comment on that because, but more from the standpoint of the level of corporate involvement that we've seen, and I think it's probably impacted most everybody in this room if they're a communicator, in terms of the stance that companies are taking and the C-suite is taking in a very active stance here. It's described as one of the most anti-LGBT laws in the country today. It's more than about bathroom use when you really dig into it. It's about discrimination. But the level of engagement by the C-suite on this issue is something that I haven't seen in some time. And we talked about other issues that didn't get this kind of attention by the C-suite, including, I know you challenged me on this, including companies, they're B2B companies. They sell to other businesses. They don't sell to consumers. So what's the trend here, and how do you feel about it?
I think the trend is moving certainly in the right direction to hold people it's called accountability, right? We're accountable now. And when you look at the issues that's in front of us, this is more moving from civil rights to human rights, just being really humane with individuals. The gay agenda has been challenged over the years in multiple ways, but I want to focus just a little bit on the environment being ready to receive that. More than 80% of Fortune 500 companies have what we call network groups, whether they're business resource groups or diversity business resource groups, what have you. Those groups are very valuable to the delivering on the strategy around culture, value, and what we care for in organizations. So those who have their pride groups, those groups are designed by the minority for the majority to have an experience otherwise they would not have. So oftentimes we'll get messages I joined Hyatt. We were focused on MLK Day was in January, and Black History was in February, and Women History was in March. And one of our leaders says, "You keep focusing on only the black people." Well, I didn't just determine that Martin Luther King was born in January. Congress gave the black folks 28 days, and they're mad because they didn't get 31. So there's issues there. But those events, and I digress just to be a little humorous here, because we take this too seriously when the answer is right in front of us, and sometimes we talk ourselves out of the answer. So I said that to say that those organizations who are supportive have affinity groups that are helping to build that awareness in the organization. So you're attending events like the Pride Parades. They're attending events of Out and Equal Workplace Summit. They're part of HRC. For example, with us, our head of HR is on the board of directors of HRC. We then have a very junior person on the Diversity Council. So they're bringing information back from HRC that will help us to understand how we need to form our messages, right, and keep us ahead of us. So we're relevant not only internal but also external to drive our agenda. So we can influence them, right, on how to look from a risk management perspective or compliance perspective and do some best practices and sharing. The other benefit is that they're doing business now without hotels. My first year in diversity working at Hyatt, we generated $98 million in revenue. That was money that was left on the table and it was generated with diverse organizations. We've chosen now to do business with Hyatt because of our commitment to diversity and inclusion. So organizations who see that value, the dollars, the gay community will spend $20 trillion in tourism between now and 2020. Yeah. So money speaks volumes. Yeah. Being able to assemble themselves, if more. Statistics shows 8 out of 10 people either know someone that's gay or have a relative that is gay or some interaction. So you now have CEOs now who have relatives and friends and employees who have children who are gay are a little more sensitive to the topic than they once were before.
Yeah, great.
So that sensitivity is there.
Great point. And we're gonna open it up to questions now. And while you're the first person to raise their hand, somebody will bring a microphone over to you. But I think to summarize what you just said, because I brought up, we have a client that was on the front page of the Journal yesterday, beat a big major Fortune 50 company, and you wonder why. Well, you just answered it. It's becoming personal to CEOs as well, and that's why they're engaging. That's really interesting. Let's open it up to questions.
Good morning, good panel. My name is Tom Wolf. I'm with BP America. This is for anybody in the panel, but Tyronne, I'll give it to you initially. A lot of companies have, diversity and inclusion groups. It's got its own acronym, D&I, so it must be in a lot of companies, right?
Yes.
But what does success look like? You have analytical success, anecdotal success. What does that look like over time? So not just white people run hotels, but what does that look like going forward? Because right now, no company is where they want to be. Where should they be getting to?
So again, my methodology and approach is top-down, bottom-up, starting with our board of directors. So now we have 3 women on our board of directors. We have an African-American male. We're looking to increase diversity there. Our C-suite, we have 6 members. 2 of the 6 are women. So we have a role coming up. If that third one, we've committed that we'll have a diverse slate of candidates to choose from. If that's a woman, we'll reach parity right at the top of the house there. We're now looking at our pipeline to make sure that when we bring in talents that we have a diverse slate of talent to choose from, internal and external, to make sure that we're closing that gap around representation, that piece. Our strategy is broken up in 3 components: workforce, workplace, and marketplace. The workforce is look at the evidence that's in front of us. So we know that there's 80 million baby boomers that will transition out of the workforce. The next generation workers are 40 million. There's a shortfall of 40 million qualified workers. Today, there's more than 12,000 underdegree holders in the workplace. We employ a lot of people without degrees. Right? So we want to go after that talent. We have people that are making upwards of $60,000, $70,000 waiting tables in our hotels. That's a good living that most are not aware of. So again, at top down, bottom up, we'll be able to get to where we want to go. We want to be known for best in class for hospitality. Our competitors are not Hyatt, it's not Hilton and not Sheraton. It's Airbnb. It's the .coms who don't have a hotel. So it's shifting. So it's going to, there's no one silver bullet. There's no one approach. We've got to look at this holistically around the global organization. In Japan today, this is a women's issue. Whenever I raise this issue with women in the United States, it ruffles feathers. But we have to look at the future state of where D&I is going. In Japan, women get additional 2 days for PMS. More than 70% of the workforce in China is actually women. So you start looking at benefits and you start looking at succession planning, all those things that are in the workplace, engagement, succession planning, health and welfare, defined benefit, all those types of things that supporting the workforce, we have to look at it with a different lens to be able to make sure that we're harnessing and supporting that workforce. And then marketplace is how we show up. Where do we go into marketplace to show our commitment to not only the community, but also to our customer base and to our suppliers, making sure that we're partnering to making sure that women and minority-owned businesses are getting their fair share of the pie. So there isn't just one way to look at it. You got to do it all. The business resource groups, again, following that, one is to build the awareness and to point out things that are not in compliance with the values and the culture of the organization, where they can't come to work their full selves. So you want to use that, and that shows up in your engagement surveys. Engagement surveys, women and people of color have a tendency, and I say tendency for a reason, not to bite the hand that feeds them. They may not give the manager or the leader, 5 stars, but they may meet halfway and not be explicit. White men have a tendency to say, this company sucks, and here's why it sucks. If you don't fix it, we're going to be out of here, right? So again, you've got to understand those different cultures, right, and where people are interpreting things differently. And I think communicators have a way of communicating those messages through storytelling.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, please.
Yes.
I don't need it anymore.
Oh, okay. All right. So I kind of have a two-parted question. The first was I was curious when you were discussing the Bud Billiken Parade and it just kind of coming into the community in a particular way. So I first just wanted to know how that was the Hyatt, right, on Cermak that.
It was a Hyatt Corporation, and we invited all of we have 15 hotels in Chicago. We invited all of our employees to participate. So we had about 300 employees to march in that parade. Okay.
So the question I'm asking is about there was an unfortunate situation at the Hyatt on Cermak. Is that right?
Oh, our Hyatt on King Drive.
If you think about the exactly. So it kind of connected the dots when you were So I'm just curious first how that was handled, and then the second question was to anyone that, for my organization, which is the Nature Conservancy, member-based groups like ours, which have a bread and butter, a constituency that we go to regularly. So when there is this shift in compliance or shift in what the C-suite is doing from the top down, either for its employees or for its members, does it kind of sometimes squeeze out the bread and butter folks, if that makes sense? How do you handle that when you start making a shift as to what's going to be acceptable and what's not for those who are already there or who are already members or are current clients, and they start seeing that shift and they don't necessarily agree? What do you do there? We have obviously a mixed bag of folks who are part of our organization, so how do you handle that?
So I would start with going back to our conversation we had about being an environment of inclusion. So that's the latter question first there, is that creating an environment where everybody can thrive and strive regardless of his or her background, race, gender, sexual orientation, years of service, et cetera. You've got to make sure that you're looking at that across to be inclusive, right? Diversity without inclusion leads to confusion. So if you don't have any diversity in the organization and you're not focused on inclusion, you have a confused organization that doesn't tie back to the values and your commitment of the organization. So one is creating that environment, and that formula, I think, is very relevant to any successful diversity strategy. It's also moving from programs to sustainability. Everybody has a problem, they create a program. We got an issue with women being engaged in work, let's do a mentoring program. Do we measure that? Do we track that? And what happens after they finish that program is left up to, right, and the people left out. Organizations who build and buy talent at the same time, when you bring talent in from the outside, you're told, that outside person is told, the organization is broken, come in and fix us, right? You've got to prepare this, you've got to do this, and so forth. But you're forgetting that the people that's in the organization is working very hard. You create polarization right on the onset. That person's coming in, doesn't know who's fixable, who's not, and who wants to be fixed. Right? Everybody wants to be leveraged. So how do you get to mindset from managing diversity to leveraging diversity? Organizations who actually look at diversity as a problem to be solved is trying to manage a situation that they'll never be able to control or manage in a global 24/7 operations, right? So you go to that. So the leveraging piece is leveraging people for where they are, give them the tools to be even more successful. When we have a tendency to talk about performance management, we focus on those things that we don't do very well. The paradigm needs to shift and focus on the things that you do very well and provide support for those things that you don't. I am not a good project manager, but I know strategy, I know process, I can create models, I can deliver training. Now I have a very strong project manager so we can get the work done a lot faster. So it's actually knowing the organization, knowing the talent, and making sure you leave no one behind. We lead what we call empathy interviews. So we have conversations about how is the environment, what would you do differently, how can we help you to be your best. It's leading with those type of empathy conversations will give you a better resolve than focus on the things that people don't do and can't do and will never ever change. Especially life after 50, you really can't change those behaviors. Right? How do you actually maximize and leverage that for the greater good of the organization? Now, the sensitive situation about the unfortunate, many of you may have not known, there was a shooting at our hotel on King Drive. A young man, there was a party going on, there was an argument, a young man tried to break it up, an innocent bystander, he gets shot and killed. Now, for us, it's being humane. It's making sure that we comfort the family in that moment, taking them out of the crowd, giving them a private space to be able to mourn, to rope off the environment, to cover the body up, all those things we're doing. What did make the news that same exact night, some woman hung herself in the hotel. So we had 2 incidents in the same night that we had to manage from a communications perspective, not only externally, but also internally. How do you have a conversation with a colleague that's at the front desk? Right, and this incident happened. So very, unfortunate circumstances, but someone has to stand up. Having power does not always equate to great leadership. Power with no leadership equals disaster. So someone has to step up, and we all have to step up and be leaders in that situation and do what's right for mankind. It's moving from being humanity to being humane. Are we really being humane towards one another and showing empathy and care without the judgment, without the bias? And we all have bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, we all have it. We have to own that and move beyond that. That takes training, it takes skill, and it takes deliberate and intentional efforts to move that envelope.
Well, great question. And with that, thank you very much, Lauren. So with that, I think we're going to, I've got the high sign, and I think we achieved our goal because we always want to leave everybody wanting more with these events, and you guys have done that. So thank you so much. It's terrific. And with that, I'm going to